You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 28, Destiny and the Raven. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Norman Lau.
Each week on Gene-ology, we explore the early TV writing of Gene Roddenberry, years before he created Star Trek, looking for signs of the socially relevant messages he was famous for working into his creations.
And this week, we have a real treat for you, a show no one has ever seen before, because it was never filmed. Prepare to meet Destiny and the Raven. Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here's how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, leave us a review and a rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, here is Earl Green with this week's trivia.
We've got a lot to cover today, Norm, so I am going to try to get through this at a pretty good gallop. Destiny and the Raven is Gene's second draft script for a pilot episode of his Sam Houston story, which, on the cover page of this document, is no longer titled The Man from Texas, but now bears the title Warrior, The Life of Sam Houston, dated February 18th, 1958. But there's also an untitled final draft dated March 19th, 1958, a full month after the Warrior, Destiny and the Raven draft, and that final draft retains the Man from Texas title. Those are the two documents we'll be looking at today, as Gene tries to give his ultimately unmade show an exciting beginning. There was another attempt at a pilot script titled Exile, but again noted as an episode of Warrior, The Life of Sam Houston, with a very different story construction. Exile is unfortunately undated, so there's nothing to indicate if it was written before or after Destiny and the Raven, but there's a lot of markup by hand, presumably Gene's own writing and markup in the Exile script, crossing out entire scenes and making it seem as though another draft would probably be forthcoming. Both stories have the setup structure of giving Sam Houston a new mission and new marching orders at the end of each show, so both of them potentially the pilot episode. Since writing an entire screenplay is not a thing to be done lightly or cheaply, it's probably safe to assume that Gene's September 1957 pitch document for a series about the legendary Sam Houston garnered enough attention from Screen Gems to pay him to write a script and then a couple of revisions of that script. As we mentioned last week, none of this work led to a show, so we can infer that after reading two different pilot scripts and not seeing what they wanted, even the most patient patrons of the arts will probably prod the artist to move on to something else. In any case, it was a paycheck, and by this point in 1958, Gene was well on his way to becoming one of the most prolific scriptwriters for Have Gun Will Travel.
Major Reeves is transporting war prisoners up from the Seminole campaign.
To General Jackson's camp? That's interesting. Especially since the turnoff to there is several miles back.
If you got business here, mister, name it.
I was on my way there, on leave. Sort of a homecoming. Until I saw those Seminole moccasin prints on the trail.
Of course. Even an adopted Cherokee would be curious.
I'm not curious anymore, Mr. Bearley. I can make out exactly what's going on.
I take it you don't have troops with you, Lieutenant?
For the record, gentlemen, the name is Houston. Lieutenant Sam Houston, under Jackson's command. And since you say the Seminoles are for the general, Here's a receipt, Major. I'm accepting the prisoners for it.
Regular army braid don't impress me, mister.
Reeves!
I'm tired of this pussyfooting around. And if he wants them, he's gonna have to take them.
That's the point, Major. I just have.
Jeff. Now here's the way it's gonna be, mister. One lieutenant killed while assaulting me.
Prologue. Eastern Tennessee, 1816. Lieutenant Sam Houston rides along the Yokachi Trail, one arm in a sling from a recent battle, until he finds the body of a Native American who was shot in the back with his hands and feet in chains, unable to defend himself. Act 1. In a nearby forest, a lone Seminole Indian tries to put distance between himself and the captors from whom he has just escaped. His hands and feet are also shackled, and a ball and chain keeps him from making any significant headway. He's not just any man, he's Osceola, war chief of the Seminole tribe, and he hears the voices of his pursuers closing in. Sam Houston happens upon a trading post run by an Indian agent named Bearley. More chained and shackled Seminole Indians are being held there. Bearley himself is there, along with a militiaman with an unpleasant disposition, Major Reeves. There's also a very nervous plainsman by the name of Deaf Smith, who earned his name by being very hard of hearing. And Reeves and Bearley are openly discussing doing away with Smith, who has voiced objections to their practice of selling Indians into slavery. But the two slavers have another problem. They're trying to march their captured Seminoles through Cherokee territory. The two tribes aren't friendly, and the shackled Seminoles have been an easy target for their enemies. A Cherokee trader named Tucky is considering blankets and muskets, but he's more interested in the helpless Seminoles. And he's even more interested when Bearley's men drag the newly recaptured Osceola back to the trading post. Tucky identifies the war chief and makes it clear what he wants to buy: the scalp of a freshly killed and hated enemy. Sam Houston emerges from the trees, where he's been watching the whole disgusting exchange happening, and where no one else saw him. He interrupts the proceedings, and when Reeves tries to pull rank, Houston is not impressed. Bearley claims that Reeves is transporting Seminole POWs from Florida to General Jackson, but Houston points out they're headed in the wrong direction for that. When Houston says he knows exactly what's happening here, there's an exchange of worried glances among the other men. If these really are prisoners of war, Houston offers to save Reeves and Bearley a trip. Houston serves under General Jackson and writes a receipt to accept the prisoners on the general's behalf. Reeves, who stands to profit from selling the Seminoles into slavery, orders his guards to kill Sam Houston. Houston points out to Reeves' guards that, faced with charges of murder, the last choice they would be given in their lives would be a choice between the firing squad or the gallows. They stand down. Reeves grabs a musket to do the dirty deed himself, but finds himself staring down the barrel of Deaf Smith's rifle. Smith gets the keys from one of the guards, takes a horse, and chooses sides. He's with Houston now. They ride off with the Seminole captives in tow. Infuriated, Reeves and Bearley devise a new scheme to take revenge on Sam Houston, who did leave them with a handwritten receipt for the prisoners. They'll frame him for leading those prisoners into a massacre. Houston, Smith, and the Seminoles are brought up short by what sounds like the cry of a wolf. Instead, it is Big Fox, a lone Cherokee warrior who hasn't seen Houston since he was a boy, and he recognizes Houston as the Raven. Houston was raised among Cherokees and joined their tribe, and he knows Big Fox of old. Houston's old friend and blood brother warns him of the trap Tucky has laid for them, and it's a no-win scenario. As a Cherokee taking Seminoles into Cherokee country, Houston would be expected to allow the prisoners to be killed and face an army court-martial as a result. But as a white man riding into Cherokee country, Houston would be expected to die alongside his prisoners. Houston has one ace up his sleeve. The Cherokee chief, Ulutika, is the man who raised Houston and inducted him into the tribe. He might grant his son an audience with the other chiefs, and give Houston a chance to talk them into letting him take the Seminoles to General Jackson. Deaf Smith is skeptical that this will work, and frankly, so is Houston. But Houston is granted the chance to plead to the council for the Seminoles' lives. Unfortunately, Tucky is there, shouting over the elders of the tribe and setting a sly verbal trap for Houston. It looks like, at the very least, Houston may have to sacrifice the life of the Seminole war chief to Tucky. But Tucky wants Houston to kill him, to prove he still respects the Cherokee's ways. Ulutika gives his son a worried look. What have you gotten yourself into? Houston starts putting on Cherokee clothes and war paint. He underestimated Tucky, and he has no idea how to get out of killing Osceola. Act 2. Osceola has been unchained and tied to a stake by Tucky, who hands Houston a knife. But to the surprise of everyone there, Houston slashes his own palm with the knife and offers Osceola his name and his place in the tribe. He then cuts Osceola's palm, and the war chief offers his name. They clasp hands. Their names exchanged, the Seminole war chief is now the Raven, and Houston, taking his place, challenges Tucky to a duel. You want the Seminole war chief? I'm right here. And Houston makes sure to anticipate Tucky's every move, verbally baiting and emasculating his opponent between skirmishes. Smith nervously positions himself near Ulutika and Osceola. At a glance, Houston doesn't seem to have the advantage. He still has one arm in a sling. But he is able to counter Tucky's overly aggressive gambits and taunt him into making further unwise moves. In the end, Houston is victorious, not because he overcame his opponent, but because Tucky fell and impaled himself on his own knife. The next day, Houston is still an honored guest of the tribe, and the Seminoles are still alive. General Andrew Jackson himself arrives in the Cherokee village, led there by Major Reeves and Bearley, who are already certain that the Seminoles Houston took from them are dead. If that's true, Jackson will have Houston court-martialed. But the Seminoles are alive and well. Houston and Osceola have returned their proper names to one another, and Reeves and Bearley have been outed as slavers. Sam Houston is offered a posting as an Indian agent by Old Hickory, and accepts the post. Deaf Smith figures that his life expectancy increased the moment Houston showed up, and he opts to stay with him. The end. And maybe just the beginning.
First of all, I was absolutely riveted with the recap, Earl, because the script is so dense and there's so much detail. I applaud you for getting around it all. And still, like, after listening to it, it's all just a whirl in my mind, like how this show could not have been made.
I think that's going to be a running theme for today's show. And I'm glad you liked the recap. I kind of went a bit longer than I normally do, precisely because this one can't be seen. Because it never got anywhere near a soundstage. It never got anywhere near a filming location. It was never cast. It was never made. And so I thought, okay, we need to be more verbose than usual on this one. So I appreciate you and everyone listening indulging me on that. The first half of the recap was a lot longer than the second half, precisely because it is so dense and there is so much setup, so much very specific setup in that first half that makes it possible to kind of rocket through the second half, because a lot of the second half is leading up to the fight scene and then the fight scene. And one of the biggest surprises for me at the very beginning of the script, and this is in the scene setup, the stage direction, Gene telling us that Houston is in his mid-20s. Now, I'm kind of confused. You remember last week we were reading the series Bible, and Gene very specifically said that we were going to meet Sam Houston as the fully formed hero of legend. In his mid-20s? We may play the casting game here in a little bit, trying to figure out who would have been in this, but for some reason I kept on defaulting to Paladin from Have Gun Will Travel. But, wow, mid-20s? I guess the various wars and other conflicts going on kind of forced a certain level of maturity onto everyone at that point in history, because as someone who is celebrating currently 26 straight years of being 25 years old, I just don't usually think of mature and mid-20s in the same sentence. I sure as hell wasn't.
We had a really interesting discussion before recording this show about the relativity of people in the ages in the 1940s, 50s versus the relative age now and the comparison in between. And let me put it this way. When I sat down with a financial advisor, he said, remember, the reason why that you retired at 65 is because you weren't expected to reach 80. So you had that entire longevity of your savings for the next 15 years. Some people are living into their 90s and into their early 100s, but they're still retiring at 67, which means that the longevity, the human lifespan has been prolonged because of medical technology, cleaner living, etc. Back then, not so much, right? And the proliferation of disease, war, and in this story, Indian violence, U.S. military violence, all of that. I think you're lucky if you get to your 40s.
You're
right?
Probably right. And me personally, I probably don't get to retire. I've never really fully understood the concept of being retired. Retired? I'm still being tired the first time.
Yeah. It's like, I don't want to be re-exhausted. In the prologue, which is interesting because I think this is the first time we actually get a proper prologue in any of Gene's scripts, the prologue had me. The year 1816, the place, Eastern Tennessee, where the Okachi Trail enters Cherokee country. There's so much detail just in the narration voiceover alone. The bullet-chipped rocks. Its history is Indian against white, white against white, Indian against Indian. There's the tone and the texture and the depth of it. It's rare that we see that in a Gene script. I don't think that I've seen it, at least again in this type of specificity before.
We have seen some instances in the past of shows where there is kind of this omniscient third-person narrator doing some heavy lifting in the setup, but never with this much specificity, because this almost makes it sound like that narrator, this is someone who was there. It's like, who is this we're hearing from? Because this is someone with very specific knowledge of what was happening, and not exactly a 30,000-foot view, maybe 350 feet, give or take.
So this is kind of a cold open, and if, for all of you out there, we all know how important the cold open is. The cold open gets you to the opening credits, and then the opening credits gets you to usually the first act. But in this case, the opening credits gets you to the very first commercial. But the hook is so good, I almost want to forego the first commercial to get into the first act. So I'm wondering how that would have played out in TV at the time.
I'm trying to remember, and I'm drawing a blank here because this would have been stuff I saw in reruns as a kid. I'm trying to remember the format of the shows that Screen Gems was putting out in this era. Because that very specific thing where, we have this zinger of a cold open and titles and it very specifically notes in the script, fade out to first commercial. I wonder if that was the Screen Gems format as opposed to almost everything we have seen prior to this being in the Ziv format.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair. And also, when we're watching shows like this, even though the show wasn't made, shows of this era, we're really watching it out of context and certainly out of format and broadcast format, to be sure, because we get it on DVD or YouTube or etc., and all of the commercials are cut. So all you do is get the fade out, fade in, and that's a little bit more contemporary, when you're not dealing with commercials, if you're paying for premium services in streaming. So yeah, I guess you have the captive audience. There's, they're all surrounding the TV either after dinner or with TV dinners on the TV trays, and they're there. And there's no better way to get your number one advertiser a captive audience than right after an amazing credit sequence.
Like we said, this one's a zinger. We immediately meet Sam Houston. We get the narrator to introduce him to us, and boom, hey, there's trouble in Tennessee. Now, later on in Act 1, Houston is talking to Deaf Smith. He says, there's a verse in the Iliad here. So, first off, we're going straight into Homer, and not the dope kind of Homer either. I feel like this further makes the case that the work Gene did on his Sam Houston series, whatever title it might have taken, transferred very easily to Have Gun Will Travel, because like Houston, Paladin is more than just an old soldier. He's cultured, he's well-read, he is living the life at the Carlton Hotel in San Francisco until someone who received his card sends for him. So, however Paladin's creators envisioned him, I think Gene must have seen an opportunity to imbue that character with the same qualities as Sam Houston. Or the cross-pollination may have gone the other way because Gene's first 2 Have Gun scripts have already been broadcast at this point. It could be Paladin is influencing Gene's version of Sam Houston.
There's so much, again, detail and descriptive quality that Gene has in this script. You would think that it was like the last script he would ever write because he wanted to fit in so much stuff. So there's, again, I am no expert on American Indian culture or American Indian history for that matter. There's a scene that you described when Sam Houston has the Seminole captives and he's trying to escape with them. And he runs into a Cherokee, his former tribe, and a Cherokee warrior named Big Fox. They both hold their palms up in that, and forgive me, I don't mean this in any slight way or shape or form, but in that how type of exposed palm greeting. But in this case, Gene makes it a point that each of them see the scar from a blood oath that they gave each other, which legitimizes Houston being there among the Cherokee with Seminole captives in tow. I've never really heard it described that way. I'm not exactly sure if I'm reading too much into it, but basically Sam Houston was saying, I remember you, you're my friend, and here's the scar to prove it. So this is basically my street cred. Let's talk before you start shooting at me.
I am one of you. Let me speak. Let me ask questions first before the shooting starts.
I just thought that was brilliant, and I never really saw it that way. So again, this isn't just a TV show, but it's almost kind of like a history lesson. I will get into that much later on. I think that there's a great line in here from Deaf Smith when he says, he tries to break up the fight between Houston and, I like calling him Beavis because he just reminds me of a Beavis. He says, well, it's like this. Just because a man eats stewed rooster doesn't mean he enjoy cockfights. I just like the way it sounds. Like, it's just a nice kind of, look, there's a guy here amongst all of these enemies that are surrounding Sam Houston, but he's not one of them. But he's also not his friend. He's like, let's see how this plays out.
Oh, yeah. You definitely get the impression that Smith is... And they get into this in Act 2 because the 2 tribal chiefs are standing next to each other. And Smith just kind of... The stage directions are very specific that Smith kind of backpedals until he is between and behind these 2 tribal chiefs. It's like, okay, if this turns into a bigger fight, I want to be between the 2 men that nobody is going to immediately shoot at.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great directing note right there.
You could say that Gene's directing from the script. You could accuse him of that. Or you could say that this is building that character. Which brings up the really interesting question. If this had gone to series, if this had continued, would we have seen something where Deaf Smith's loyalty to Houston might have been in doubt?
As long as it's historical, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the whole thing that we're hinging on here. Like, all of these characterizations in some way, shape, or form, especially Sam Houston's, but all the ancillary characters are rooted somehow in history.
Right. And speaking of historical accuracy, I have to ask this question. When you read the part in the script where Sam Houston and Tucky are basically kind of doing this Indian wrestling to the death in front of the Cherokee Council, was it just me, or were you also hearing the Amok Time fight music in your head?
Not just you.
Just checking.
And if we ever made this public, just that particular description, I'm pretty sure a lot of Star Trek fans would too. It's just too perfect, of a fit. Going into Act 2, there's a really interesting thing I think we're going to get into in discussion. But Sam Houston stabs his palm and takes on the name of Osceola. And Osceola stabs his palm and takes on the name of Sam Houston. I didn't know that this was a cultural detail of that time where when you trade blood with another person, at least in this Indian culture and at least in the Seminole culture, you take on their name and their soul. And that is part of the overall plot of how Sam Houston gets out of the situation that he put himself in, because it's about ritual blood oath. It's about the specificity and the honor of names. It's about the culture and the respect thereof, something that even Stonewall Jackson couldn't technically argue with.
Yeah, because, he is not trying to lawyer his way out of it in some kind of white guy way.
And not being able to flex his military influence as well, or his rank, or his privilege. But here's a big question, though, Earl. Because this has been done already or referenced several times between this current fight and the street credibility that I mentioned before between Houston and Big Fox, how much can the human hand endure when it comes to something like this? Because it won't be the first time, and it's certainly not the last time.
Yeah, I mean, you're exchanging names, you're exchanging social stations, you're exchanging souls, you're exchanging any blood-borne illnesses that you have, potentially. There's a lot going on there.
There's an interesting thing also with this whole aspect of the war between cultures. And there's a war between, again, understanding, the white man's side of the reverence that the Indian cultures have towards each other, even though that they're enemies, but also the depth that Gene brings to describing what essentially is an Indian wrestling scene. However, close your eyes, dear listeners, and imagine this. Two men in a circular field or plain, both of them having dug holes in the ground near them, probably about a few paces away from each other, and then shoving the handles of their knives. Not talking pocket knives here. We're talking about Bowie knives, like Crocodile Dundee knives. Sticking those knives in the ground with their blades pointing up. And then the two of them assuming Indian wrestling positions, and then round after round after round of seeing who's going to become the dominant combatant, in this equation. And then with the possibility of being impaled on one of these knives. I have never heard or even remotely have been teased about some type of fight like this before in Westerns ever. I've never seen this. I'm wondering where this came from. Again, that's just anecdotally saying I know where it came from. Gene did the research. It proves he did. I would have loved to have seen this.
Just the sheer amount of violence going on in this for 1958, one wonders if this might not have been one of the first things to get either cut or watered down. In the script, very close to the end, there are some beautiful pilot setup lines, and I'm going to fess up to this right now. I love semi-cheesy pilot setup lines. General Jackson says, "The first time I met you, Sam, you had 2 muskets in you, and you were working on your 3rd. I said then you were either a fool or a man with an interesting future." And then mere moments later, there's this exchange between Sam Houston and Deaf Smith. Houston says, "I don't look for trouble, Mr. Smith, but if a man's true to his principles, there's some things he can't avoid." And Smith says, "Mind if I stick around? I'm just curious to see what you can't avoid tomorrow." Here's the thing. Gene is really good at these parting shots that make clear that even though this is the end of this episode, it's the beginning of the rest of the story. Now, let me kind of troll through some of Gene's later works to prove this point. Compare the previous scenes that I mentioned to the send-off that was intended to launch the Star Trek episode Assignment Earth as a spin-off series. Kirk says, "I'm afraid we can't reveal everything we know, Mr. Seven." And Spock says, "Captain, we could say that Mr. Seven and Miss Lincoln have some interesting experiences in store for them." Now, that line just kind of goes sailing off into nowhere because, of course, we did not get Assignment Earth as a spin-off series. But also consider this exchange from right at the end of Encounter at Farpoint. Picard says, "Some problem, Riker?" Riker says, "Just hoping this isn't the usual way our missions will go, sir." Picard says, "Oh no, number one. I'm sure most will be much more interesting." These are not necessarily the last lines in the script, but they are kind of a wink and a nod. They're a verbal bottle of champagne smashed across the bow of whatever this new venture is. The creator of the show is lobbing a message right over the fourth wall, like it's McKinley's monkey, and he's telling the audience, stick around, this is going to be fun. It's a really good trick to plant your flag like that, and maybe not have it seem like a giant cheese ball in the middle of the script. You're saying, this is my series, this is where it starts, and here's where we're going next. Gene really has that gift of the magic series pilot send-off line. Maybe it is cheesy, maybe it's obvious. It is one of my favorite things that he does over and over again. One question keeps coming back to the forefront of my mind here, Norman, and I'm just going to get right to that question. This wasn't good enough to be its own show? Seriously? This may simply be proof that studio and network heads, be it in the 1950s or the 2020s, frequently suffer from a form of absolute cluelessness that is then passed down to the generations of executives at the studio that arrive after them. Or, maybe I'm being a little bit mean-spirited there. This is exciting stuff, and the moral dilemma is so Gene. This reminds me, strangely enough, it's nothing like The Secret Weapon of 117 at all. But it reminds me so much of that because this is, Roddenberry Unbound that we're getting here. Sam Houston sets out to do the right thing, and he stirs up a hornet's nest. His ability to be true to his word and to game the system of local customs is put to the test. And so it's not just his ability to come up aces in a physical fight that comes into play here. He has to outthink his adversaries.
I'm glad you brought that up. I'd like to see if we can ask the audience this question, because we've had members, from the listening audience email us about, I was there at the time when these shows came out. This was kind of like the sentiment of the time. You guys aren't really far off base, but if you were there like we were, like these listeners were, then you would understand a little bit more. I'm putting this out there in the podcast and hopefully out there in the universe. If anyone has any connection to any resource where we can at least get a follow-up as to why this was never picked up, please let us know, because Earl and I have been having offline conversations and in this show, online conversations about that big question. Why was this show not developed or picked up? Because it's too good, it's too Gene, it's too historical to not have moved forward. So why didn't it? That's the big question. I asked the same question back in the previous episode when we covered the pitch. Why not Sam Houston amidst the almost endless production wave of Westerns at the time?
Yeah, if you work in the Columbia Pictures mailroom, please note that we are not asking you to risk your gainful employment there. But yeah, anyone who has any piece of the chain of correspondence that may have followed the submission of these scripts, yeah, we'd love to hear it, because we haven't found anything like that in the archives. When you're doing a pilot, the sky is kind of the limit, within reason, because the show is going to have a budget, it is going to have specific allocated resources, and the show has to fit within those parameters. A certain amount of reading the prevailing winds of the market is also expected. Are cop shows hot right now? Or westerns? Or maybe something sci-fi? If you can put your own unique spin on something within those restrictions, you might just get a show out of it. What we really don't get is how Gene did not make a sale with Destiny and the Raven and with his Sam Houston series. All we can do is speculate wildly. We don't know what decisions were made by the executives at Screen Gems after reading this pilot script, and what caused them to say, pass. Although, I have a theory that we will get to in the wrap-up. I think that Houston's ironclad ethics transferred very well to Paladin, and also made a mark on Gene Roddenberry. So, this was not wasted work, thankfully. I'm glad we are finally getting to share this with everyone, even in this super condensed, summarized form. This is a Gene Roddenberry original that has waited more than 65 years for an audience to experience it in any way. And Norm, I don't know about you, I'm frankly kind of humbled that we get to let this particular genie out of the bottle now.
You know, I think the weight of that statement just hit me all of a sudden, that we're talking about this live for the first time, exposing an entire audience of Gene Roddenberry fans and fans of this genre, you know, to this specific piece of television historical archived work. Because I remember when you pitched this show to Rod, you wanted to talk about, you know, chronicling and, for all intents and purposes, archiving, you know, as much as we could about, you know, our research of going into Mr. District Attorney and you know, Highway Patrol, Harbor Command, you know, all of these shows. Eventually, we're going to get to The Lieutenant and, of course, Have Gun Will Travel. But when you have something as specific, you know, and significant as this historical figure, and so well researched in just exacting detail, I don't think this was just I want to write scripts so I can, like, you know, support my family, albeit that's one of the reasons why. I think that there is a specific mission involved with this, with Gene Roddenberry, where he's basically saying, I want to bring a character who's beyond reproach and can't be questioned because I'm basing him on an actual historical character. And bringing that whole, the weight of that, you know, onto the television scene. Because, look, there are Westerns that are very good, you know, that we talked about in the last episode. There are Westerns that have great characters, like Paladin, you know, that are very morally centric characters, you know, but none of them were real. This guy's real. And this is literally, at that time, that truth is stranger than fiction, you know, axiom that is real. You can't invent a guy like this. It's almost even impossible in 2024 to believe that a man like this existed. Why wouldn't you want to tell that story? Why wouldn't you want to pick that up? Right? It almost seems like it's just a recipe for printing money, you know, if you were a network.
And especially at this period when we were reaching the peak of the Western as a prominent feature on the primetime schedule.
You know, there's something that doing what we do in the format that we're doing it in, we're trying to do it as chronologically as possible to kind of chart the evolution of Gene's, not only his career, but his style, which I think is really important, and how his own sense of either morality or value or, you know, his compass as a person, you know, is infused in his writing so that he, as a writer, can actually put those values into his script. Looking at something in this episode struck me as being a recurring theme, almost a genetic marker, if you will. Thank you, Earl. Please, no sound effects. Early in Act 1, there's an exchange between Houston and Reeves. Reeves being Beavis, or who I like calling Beavis. Major Reeves says to Sam Houston, "Is that how you got your arm in a sling, Lieutenant? Interfering with a superior officer?" And then Sam Houston says, smiling, "A militia uniform doesn't impress me, Major. I've seen those commissions sold over a table. I want to go back all the way to Mr. District Attorney and some of the other episodes that we've covered here. Doesn't this sound a little familiar to some of the dialogue that Gene's written in the past about these so-called war veterans using their clout to push around others? There was the episode where a criminal was like pushing like his experience and lording that over his flunkies so they would do his bidding. Like they called him like the general or the colonel. And I'm wondering if that's something that has personally grated on Gene himself to the point where he's like, you know what? I need to make an example of this. I need to show people in my audience that just because you wear a badge doesn't mean you have honor.
I wonder if this was a common archetype of person or a common problem that was happening in post-war America. Because a lot of men came back with combat experience, commendations, decorations, what have you. Mm-hmm. It was perhaps a test of character what you did with that. And cast your mind back to the bazooka episode of Highway Patrol, mm-hmm. where the guy from the army who was helping Matthews track down this stolen weapon that is causing so much havoc. At the end of the episode, when that has been accomplished, he tells Matthews, you know, we could put you in for a citation. And Matthews is just like, no, that's behind me. Mm-hmm. He says it in a slightly more roundabout way than that, but that's the essence of his response to it. Is, no, military commendations are behind me. And yet I'm sure you had some men that came back from combat who wouldn't let anybody forget that they had done this and that they had earned this rank or this commendation.
I think the episode in Mr. District Attorney that comes to mind also, and more specifically to what I said before, was police brutality, where there was, I think it was the villain in the episode was exposed to have, yes, served, but not in the capacity that his reputation preceded him to be. So I think that that's something that maybe working in the Los Angeles Police Department, maybe seeing some of these characters, rotate back to civilization, in various forms, probably like relying on clout that they don't really have, but were able to inflate because no one else really has records to check. Sure.
Oh, that's right. Because you're talking about the guy who was like, oh yeah, I took out 3 tanks, mm-hmm. With my sheer cunning and my good looks. Yep. And he never made it out of the records office. He was radar.
Right. But everyone else, because he had the training, again, just like Beavis or Reeves, just because they have the training and just because they have something sewn on their uniform doesn't make them the kind of person that Sam Houston cares to treat with in that same respect. He's like, look, actions speak louder than words. And as of right now, the only actions that I'm seeing right here are slavers' actions.
Utterly contemptible actions.
Far be it for me, though, to skip an opportunity or miss an opportunity to talk about some history when it comes to the research that has been done. All of the research really is at Gene's credit here, but some of the things that I read about the characters that he started to frame in this episode are really interesting. So, well, first of all, let's talk about the Raven. Why is this episode called Destiny and the Raven? You've mentioned before, we're going to talk about probably a reference to the Iliad later on in the wrap-up. But the Raven, in 1809, at the age of 16, Sam Houston ran away from home in Tennessee and lived among the Cherokees. That was established in this episode. He was adopted by Chief Uluteka and given the name Kolone, or the Raven. And he developed a lifelong affection for the Cherokee tribe and considered the Cherokee his surrogate family. Obviously, that helped him in this episode because he and Big Fox had the scars to prove it. That's real. That is a real detail. Again, it just adds to the gravitas of the legitimacy of the script. This episode also features the historical Seminole chief Osceola. Now, Osceola was named Billy Powell at birth in Alabama and became an influential leader of the Seminole people in Florida. His mother was Muskogee, and his great-grandfather was a Scotsman, James McQueen. He was reared by his mother in the Creek or Muskogee tradition. When he was a child, they migrated to Florida with other Red Stick refugees led by a relative, Peter McQueen, after their group's defeat in 1814 in the Creek Wars. There they became part of what was known as the Seminole people. Now in 1836, Osceola led a small group of warriors in the Seminole resistance during the Second Seminole War, when the United States tried to remove the tribe from their lands in Florida to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. Osceola became an advisor to Micanopy, the principal chief of the Seminole from 1825 to 1849. Osceola led the Seminole resistance to removal until he was captured on October 21st, 1837, by deception under a flag of truce, when he went to a site near Fort Peyton for peace talks. The United States first imprisoned him at Fort Marion in St. Augustine, that's in Florida, then transported him to Fort Moultrie in Charleston, South Carolina. He died there a few months later of causes reported to an internal infection of malaria. Now, the reason why I find this so tickling to me, because I live 25 minutes now north of Micanopy, and I live about an hour and a half west of St. Augustine. So I think it's like really neat that because this is a historical story, this pretty much takes place in a radius of about an hour and a half from where I live. You know, Chief Micanopy is a big deal here in, Central Florida. And this character in Sam Houston's story is a big part of that. You've spent a lot of time around these areas, Earl. And when you read a story like this, are you hoping to see a little bit more history fleshed out to places that you visited?
Oh, absolutely. And the really nice thing that I can say about this script that Gene wrote in 1958 is that it's obvious he has done a huge amount of research, but it is all worked so organically into the story, and the information is fed to you in such a natural way to tell that story. It does not feel like he is saying, man, I had to do so much research for this series pitch, and by God, you people are going to hear about it. As we do in all of the Mission Log podcasts, Norman, we are at that point in the show where we are trying to wrap our heads around this Gene Roddenberry original from over 65 years ago that never made it to a screen, and just really not much was known about it until now. If anything, it was probably an item on a list. Hopefully, we've been able to bring it to life as at least a short story for everyone listening to this. For my money, this is Gene's best work since The Secret Weapon of 117, and for the same reasons that made Secret Weapon such a highlight in Gene's work so far. Secret Weapon, if you have forgotten, was a standalone episode of an anthology show with no continuing characters, and it was just this marvelous morsel of world-building in half an hour. And I would say that's a description that could also be applied to many a classic episode of The Twilight Zone. I think Secret Weapon of 117 would have fit very nicely into The Twilight Zone, personally speaking. Now, as the pilot of an ongoing series, Destiny and the Raven has very different requirements, except in the world-building department. Gene's got half an hour to set up his rigorously researched historical scenario and characters and establish the relationships. But, very much like Secret Weapon of 117, the gloves are off here. This is Gene's chance to create the show he wants to see, and, maybe just maybe, be the showrunner of it. This is just 3 years after his first credit as Robert Wesley. And he's swinging for the fences, and I couldn't even begin to tell you how someone could read this script and go, unless it is related to one of the issues we brought up last week discussing the series pitch. Were there too many westerns already on the air? Or were the studios and networks not wanting to antagonize advertisers that might be uncomfortable with a more sympathetic, honest depiction of Native Americans' plight at the hands of white settlers. What do you think?
That is a super interesting question. And you know what? It's not outside of the realm of possibility. If we were going to play the speculation game here, the number one thing that you don't do, in entertainment is upset the apple cart of your advertising schedule or potential advertisers that are willing to put, I think at this time it was either like cigarettes or soap or automobiles. I mean, those are big commodity items. There are two of which are already like highly consumable, especially in the tobacco field, the tobacco industry. So when you have like, a Winston-Salem or Philip Morris saying, hey, we'd like to be on your show, let's just remove the Indian component. Well, what are you going to do? Say no to these, to that much money, to that kind of a blank check that's going to fund the rest of your future productions, not just for this possible show, but for future shows? Of course not. Right? We're all adults here, and we're not naive to say of course they're going to do it for the right reasons, for the moral reasons. No, they're not. They're going to do it for the financially responsible reasons for their studio. That's what studios do, right? But that's not to say that these things are mutually exclusive. You can work things in. Maybe they said hey, you know what? If you just write it with a serious, attention to detail of historical accuracy and not any type of virtue signaling, as people would say today, then maybe we would sponsor that. But I don't think that you can get to where Gene needs to be in his script without having a moral stance of what is being said here, because that's Sam Houston. That's the box. You're right, Earl. That's the box that this show puts itself in. You can't change Sam Houston's character because he is historically documented as being so. So if you say that he doesn't care about a certain plight, because we're going to get into that later on in messages, then you change the core of his character. You literally change who he was. And I don't think that Gene, if this was on the negotiating table, I don't think that he was willing to do that, which means that he stands firmly in the philosophy of Sam Houston. Let's repeat ourselves one more time. Why not Sam Houston? Okay? For everyone who has gotten this far in this particular podcast, listening to what we've said and the grandiose nature of a character who technically by all means, as a human being, shouldn't exist, I'm really disappointed that this wasn't picked up. Again, there were probably extenuating circumstances as to why. Now, I'm a huge fan of history-based entertainment, and to be honest, this script, just the script, and in our discussion too, Earl had me riveted. Every single time he said, just wait, hold on, we're going to get to it. I can't wait to hear your recap. It's because the script is so good. One of my favorite TV shows of all time is the one season in 1982 on NBC of Voyagers, where time traveler Phineas Fogg and his partner, who was basically a living history book, Jeffrey Jones, had to fix where history went wrong. So every episode, I was exposed to recreations of history, like seeing Cleopatra or Billy the Kid or Babe Ruth or Thomas Edison in every single episode, or sometimes even in the same episode. So I could not have been more excited about just the start of reading this script for the kind of hopefully entertainment/history lesson that I would have seen. We've covered scripts of Gene's in the past, but I have not yet seen one so incredibly well researched and detailed as this one. And his pitch document that we talked about in the last episode. And I think he went to the depths in his research to accurately rate characters that were both historically based and compelling to watch, because he was reflecting a personal passion for this project of a personal nature. There's something about Sam Houston that truly connected with Gene, because you can feel his passion come through the story in every single line of the script. And I think I mentioned this before in observations. It was really hard to break down because we could have probably literally referenced every, if not every other scene in the script, because it's so well written, it was so well paced, it was so well detailed. And honestly, when you have something that dense and you're trying to figure out how they're going to get this in a 26 to 28 minute format, it's mind-boggling that we didn't even see the attempt tried. and let fail as opposed to never try at all.
Yeah, and you have to figure Gene either considered Sam Houston a personal hero of his going into this project before he started it, or he went into the research and just found that he had, this buddy in history who shared kind of his values. So let's talk about those values. What is the message here? One thing I walked away from Destiny and the Raven with is integrity beats all. Without it, you are a ground-hugging weasel, like Bearley and Reeves. If you do have integrity, you fly with the Raven. I should apologize to actual weasels in the wildlife world. I feel like I may have just insulted them horribly. People around you notice integrity, whether they are above your station, like Andrew Jackson, future President of the United States, or if they are beneath you in the pecking order, like Deaf Smith. You need the respect and backup of both ends of that spectrum to succeed. Not to try to turn everything into a Star Trek metaphor here, but the captain has to impress the Admiralty enough to give them the job, and then has to impress the crew enough to earn their loyalty. And you win that loyalty by showing integrity at every opportunity, which is what Sam Houston spends this whole script doing.
Yeah, one of the things I love about getting to this moment, in our show, is that we write our notes independently of each other before we create our format, and then we get to this point, and we want to see, literally, if we're on the same page, and we are, because the script leads us down to that inevitable conclusion of what we believe Gene is writing. So, and there are key moments in this script, several of which you've already brought up, but because I didn't know what you were going to discuss, I brought these up also in my morals, meanings, and messages. And there is this interesting philosophy that Gene's addressing here when it comes to the core of Sam Houston's character, and that is death before dishonor. Now, I know that sounds very dramatic. I'd like to take you through kind of like my thought process of where this comes from. First of all, I absolutely love how Gene references Homer's The Iliad when he's explaining to General Jackson why he chose to insert himself in the Seminole versus Cherokee versus U.S. military business. Sam Houston tells General Jackson that his mother gave him her copy of the Iliad and that she underlined this passage for him. No living man can send me to the shades before my time. No man or woman born coward or brave can shun his destiny. Or I should say his or her destiny, really. Sam Houston says, I'd give my life to keep from embarrassing you. Sir, I'd give anything, except my integrity. And then General Jackson replies, integrity? White or red? And then Houston says, is there that much difference between them?
Maybe there is a whole different reason here why this show didn't get made. Because if you're saying that integrity is the same whether your skin is white or red. Norm, do you know what else was going on in history around the time Gene was working on this series pitch and these scripts? The Southern Christian Leadership Conference came into being under the oversight of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and several other leaders of the civil rights movement in 1957. They were trying to consolidate and organize their system of sit-ins and boycotts and protests in trying to organize that to a national scale to increase their impact. So if you're saying that integrity can be the same whether your skin is white or red, is it not that short of a leap to say integrity is also the same whether your skin is white or black or brown? Can you see a boardroom full of studio executives breaking out into a cold sweat over the thought that they're going to put a new show on the air at this time when everything is such a socio-political, really, powder keg, and question that the white man is not on top of the pyramid?
I mean, this is historically what we're trying to kind of decipher and decode when it comes to why certain things for Gene were able to be produced and published as the writer of his exceptional quality was at the time versus something like this, which I think is probably his finest script to date that we've read and didn't get picked up. Eventually, we're going to have to wait until 1964, 65 for this to happen, and for obvious milestones in his career to actually be, reached and accomplished. So yes, this is very quintessentially Gene. This is why this script is so important, because not just of this particular scene, but a few other scenes that, we've talked about. But there's one here that I really do love. And this goes to deeper philosophy, more world philosophy. So Sam Houston says to Dev Smith, you've mentioned this before, and I'm glad you did, because I think it's an incredible line. I don't look for trouble, Mr. Smith, but if a man's true to his principles, there's some things he can't avoid. Now, this reminded me of something from another fandom that I love, and the reference is to the Chinese philosopher Mencius. Mencius, I wonder if Sam Houston was a student of Mencius. I wonder if Gene was a student of Mencius. Mencius was a Chinese philosopher and a one-time student of Confucius's teaching. So you're dealing with this far back in time. In one of Mencius's writings, he is quoted as saying, "Life is something that I desire, but there is something that I desire more than life, and so I will not be unscrupulous in pursuing life. Death is something that I hate, but there is something that I hate more than death, and so there are perils that I will not avoid." So going all the way back to Death Before Dishonor, it is a roundabout way of saying that Sam Houston, there are perils that Sam Houston will not avoid. Oh, and remember, from Gene's pitch doc, there was a detail about what was engraved on the inside of Sam Houston's ring. And that's one word: honor. Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Special thanks to the Roddenberry Repertory Players. Our cast this week featured Cody Banning as Sam Houston, Zeke Sidwell as Major Reeves, and Todd Allen Fischer as Bearley. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that it isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com. On the next Gene-ology, Exile.
Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.